Hey guys, my name is Austin and welcome to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. Now today we're getting back working on the 99 Jeep Cherokee, and today we're going to be installing some midsection frame stiffeners. So let's get started. So with the center section Unibody Stiffeners for the Jeep Cherokee XJ, I went with the dirt-bound off-road ones because they were on sale, and I wanted to try out a different brand since the last brand I used was Iron Rock Off-Road. Now these frame stiffeners seem to be pretty beefy, just like the Iron Rock Off-Road ones, and it looks to be 3/16 inch of steel right here, so it should definitely be enough to stiffen up the unibody. Now one of the other reasons why I went with this brand compared to Iron Rock Off-Road is Iron Rock Off-Road, they actually do have another lip on there that's supposed to weld up into the floor. And everyone that I know, including myself, when you try to weld that up to the floor, you're just going to constantly burn holes through it, and you're not going to pretty much be able to weld that little lip that's on there. So I don't think it's necessary to have that on there. Now I did get a little bit ahead of myself, and I actually already sprayed the inside of these with some weld-through primer. That's going to be the step one in this process, because once we put this up to the frame, we want to basically have a protective barrier in between the unibody as well as these stiffeners right here, so that way no rust or corrosion builds up between there and rusted out even worse. So I just put a couple coats on here. I just have some Doobie Color weld-through cold galvanized primer. I'll put a link in the description below and where you can pick this up. You can pretty much pick it up at any hardware store. But as you guys know, with my red Cherokee, it does need a lot of work because it does have a lot of rust on it. I got some new doors I can throw on it, but it's going to need some rockers, which I'm planning on some 2x6 inch square tubing to replace those, as well as some rear quarter panels and possibly a new front and rear bumper. So let's go take a look at the Jeep and see what we have to do to get it all prepped before we start welding on these unibody stiffeners. Alright, so looking underneath the Jeep here, and we definitely got a lot of work cut out for us. But as far as fixing the rust in this Jeep, we're starting off the frame stiffeners, and then I'm probably going to move to patching up this floor because this side over here on the passenger side is not looking too good. It's a little bit better on the driver's side, but once we get the floor patch, I'm going to move over to the rockers, weld in some 2x6 rockers, and that way I'll have some frame supports coming off of that, and we can weld it directly to our frame stiffeners. But today we're just doing the frame stiffeners on the center section, which starts from right behind the lower controller mount and goes all the way back to the front attachment point where the leaf spring is. But to get started on getting this unibody clean, the first thing we got to do is drop the transmission cross member, so we got to be careful removing these bolts since I never removed them before. We're probably going to use some heat because we don't want to snap these off and have to drill them. And then on the other side, the driver's side, there is also a e-brake bracket that we're going to have to remove as well. And then once we get that removed, we're going to have to remove all this undercoating, remove any surface rust around here, and then prep it with some weld-through primer, and then we should be able to start fitting up our frame stiffeners and welding them on. So to start off with the cross member, I'm going to jack up the transmission just a little bit. I'm going to put a piece of board underneath the jack and just put a little bit of pressure on the transmission pan right here, so that way it doesn't kink it in any weird way, and then we'll tackle these bolts. Alright, so it looks like these bolts are going to be a 15 millimeter. We actually have two bolts going threaded into the frame, and then we also have two studs with two nuts exposed. It's going to be one bolt and one stud per side. So we should be able to get some penetrating oil over here on the nut, not so much over here in the bolts. So that's where we're going to take some heat and kind of heat up the frame a little bit and hopefully break that free. So I got some knocker loose. Let that soak in a bit. Then I'm going to take our torch, and just be careful when you're doing this on the driver's side since there's a fuel line on the back of the frame rail. And we're going to heat this up. There we go. Now as far as this bolt over here, what we're going to try and do is just heat up the surface around here, and hopefully that heat is going to penetrate where it's threaded in. So we're going to heat this up a little bit longer than we did with this nut over here, and hopefully we can crack that free. I'm going to see if I can try and squirt it with this hose right here. moved a little bit. We're just going to work it back and forth ever so slightly. Just moving a little bit, but it's probably getting hung up on the threads where it's all rusty. You can see all the rusted threads on the end where it was exposed inside the frame rail. That's what usually gets all hung up in there, and that's why they snap off. They break free fine, but they automatically stop right after, and then they get clogged up with the threads. So try to work it back and forth, and then hopefully you should be able to get them off. So this side's all free. I'm going to work on the other side, and then we'll meet back up here and take off the cross member and unbolt it from the transmission mount. Alright, so I got the driver's side off, and unfortunately I snapped one of the bolts, so that means I'm probably going to have to go back in there and try and drill it out, or I'm going to see if I can weld on a nut, and hopefully the heat from that might break it free. But we'll worry about that later. Right now our cross member is loose and drivetrain's being held up by our jack, so the next thing I'm going to do is unbolt it from the transmission mount, which there is 4 nuts that are going to be located in these holes over here, and they appear to be a 13mm, and the ones on mine are pretty crusty, but that's alright. I already put a transmission mount on order, so we're going to replace that while we're doing all this as well. So once you're on the last one, just have a hand here, because this is going to start to fall down. Alright, drop it down. Alright, so now that the transmission cross member's out, I'm going to work on getting these studs out. I showed in the video where I did the transfer case strap how to get these studs out, but I'll do it once more. Basically the technique I use is to take 2 nuts, throw them onto here, and then tighten the nuts up against each other, and it'll create a jam nut. And then you can take the top nut and then start backing it off with a wrench. I sprayed some penetrating oil in here. We're going to put the jam nuts on, and then we'll take a torch and heat up this area around here, and hopefully it'll break free. Alright, so I'm about 2 for 4 for these bolts and studs over here. This side is not working. I ended up trying to weld on a nut, and I did it 3 times and it keeps breaking off. It's closer and closer to the frame here. It's just getting too brittle. So I think what I might end up doing, instead of drilling it out, because it's a pain in the butt and it's almost impossible to get it dead straight to line up the cross member, is I might just cut out a piece of this frame rail right here and take a new piece and weld on a new nut on the back side and weld it back into place. And I'll have to do the same thing on the other side where it broke off over there. But as far as the stud on the other side, it seemed to work. I welded a nut onto there, and I went back and forth, and I eventually got it off. But before I cut those out and weld new nuts inside there, I'm going to start cleaning up this frame. First thing we got to do is take this factory undercoat off, and the best way to do that is just take a scraper, a putty knife, and kind of scrape it off. You can use a little heat, so I'll probably use a torch and just scrape it off that way. Then I'll come back with a flap disc and a wire wheel and get all of this surface rust off of here. So that way there's going to be absolutely no rust underneath the frame stiffeners that we're going to be welding on. So this is going to take a while for me, since I got a little rust here and there, and then a lot of undercoat. Alright, so I've taken a wire wheel to the frame and got all of the surface rust off. Also took a flap disc to get the heavier rust off, and now we're pretty much ready to mock fit the frame stiffener on here. And what I'm basically going to do is take a Sharpie, and any plug welds or any areas where I'm going to weld, I'm going to mark it on the frame, and that way I'm going to go back once again and make sure I have absolutely clean metal to weld to. You don't necessarily have to take all the paint off where the frame stiffener is covering, because once we get that clean, we're also going to paint the entire frame rail that we wire wheeled with some weld through primer. That way it won't build up any rust in between the frame stiffener and the frame. So I got our passenger side frame stiffener right here. I'm going to line up the holes where the cross member is. That way it'll get me in the ballpark. And then I'm just going to trace around here, and then when I do remove the extra paint that I have to, I'm going to do it kind of in a big spot, because this isn't exactly perfectly where it's going to go. It's going to have to bend to the frame once we get it on here ready to weld. Alright, so that's traced out. Let's go back and clean up where all the Sharpie is. Alright, so off camera I took care of this broken off bolt that was inside the frame. I just cut out a section here. It was actually a couple layers thick and a little bit hard to get out, but basically cut it out and then bent it out of the way. And then I found an 1/8 inch piece of steel. I cut it to size and welded a nut to the back side. This is actually 7/16, and then welded that piece of plate into here. And it's not the prettiest, but it should be strong enough, and I'm definitely going to weld the stiffener cutout onto this little plate too, so it should be nice and solid. But now I can take a 7/16 UNC bolt and be able to thread it in here, and that should work for our cross member. And over here where the original welded nut was, I just got some brand new M10 hardware, and this should work over here for getting the front part of the cross member. Alright, so all the grinding is pretty much all prepped over here on the passenger side frame rail. I'm going to go and shoot this with some weld through primer, and then we're going to start welding on the frame stiffener for this side. Alright, so I got it all painted up with all the weld through primer I have today. I got another can coming in for tomorrow when I do the other side. So I got these bolts a little bit in. We're going to slide in the frame stiffener and tighten these up to help kind of hold it in place. And then we'll get the jack as well as some C-clamps to hold it close to the frame, and then we'll start tacking it in. Alright, so this is why I got it set up for right now. I thought I had more C-clamps, but apparently I only got one, so that means we're just going to take this slow and do little section by little section. So I got two of the crossmember bolts bolted up, and it's pushing it up right here. I got a C-clamp holding over here, so it's tied up against the frame that way. I also got the jack over here with the block of wood, making sure that's up over here. So I'm going to start off with just doing this one plug weld over here, and then I'm going to move the C-clamp and do these other two plug welds up on the front. And then from there I'll tack it on the back side, and then we'll move down over here because we got some relief cuts where the frame actually does a little bit more bending, and we'll have to just keep going a little by little until we get the whole thing tacked in, and then we should be able to go back and weld the entire perimeter, and then it should be all welded into place. Alright, so I got the first plug weld done. Not pretty at all, but it should hold for now. I might go in there later and fill in any divots after I grind everything down. I also mentioned that I'm welding this with flux core wire, which is 0.035, and I'm using my Lincoln Electric 140 Easy MIG on 120 volts. So it's definitely enough power to go through the 3/16 inch steel. The main thing when doing this is you gotta be careful not to blow holes through the frame, because the frame is gonna be more thinner than the frame stiffener itself. So you just gotta be careful when doing this, and if you blow through, just kinda go back slowly and try and fill it in with some weld. But now that I got this in, I'm going to go over here to the other plug weld. I'm going to move my C-clamp over it, make sure it's tied up against the frame, and then I'll reposition the jack and make sure it's going up as far as possible. And when welding on a vehicle, you always want to disconnect the battery. I already did that when I was trying to get the bolts out by welding on a nut. Alright, so a little update. It's the next day here, and as you can see, I mostly have it all welded in on this side. I did get a whole lot of filming because it was kind of a tight area, but I'll get some more when we do the other side. But overall, welding this, it's actually pretty difficult no matter how skilled you are. I'm not saying I'm a perfect welder at all, but with the different thicknesses of metal with this 3/16 inch frame stiffener and the unibody, which could vary in the thickness because a lot of these Jeeps, they rust out from the inside of the frame rail outwards, so you can't really see how much rust is necessarily in each spot. And as you can see over here, there's actually a hole in the frame. I've kept blowing holes in a lot of areas and trying to fill them in with a little bit of weld. There's another one right here, so I'll have to go back and see if I can plug them up a little bit. For me, I had to constantly adjust the settings on the welder, and then I ran out of welding wire, and I put in a new reel that's a different brand, and it welded totally different, so it's kind of all over the place with the welds on this. But overall, the best welds, I think, are in these little divots that they have here. That seem to weld pretty good. These plug welds are a little bit difficult because I had to go around the perimeter of it, get it welded to the Jeep, and then go back later and slowly weld in the whole entire thing. And as you can see, there's still a lot of holes in there that I have to go back and plug it up. I just took a grinder to any high spots and ground it down. But I'm going to go back and fully weld this in, and then I want to get this side painted. and then we'll start over onto the other side. Alright, so I got this welded in. It's pretty much as best as it's going to get. I went back again with the grinder, just kind of grind down any high spots, any little divots or possible burn throughs in the frame. I'm going to go back after I paint it with some seam sealer, make everything look nice and kind of like straighten up some of the welds that didn't turn out as pretty. But overall on this front face over here, it actually welded pretty good, nice and solid. It was just the back side that there's kind of a design flaw in these Unibody stiffeners. It sticks out too much, and you really can't get a weld on the back side in the majority of this area over here, but I'll show you guys that. So this is what I was talking about on the back side here. There's a nice little pocket that you would think would be nice to weld, but if you got the muffler on like me, you really can't get in there at all. So these were some failed attempts over here and a couple holes in the frame, so unfortunately I'll just have to seal that up later. Even some of these plug welds were hard to get on the bottom. Because a lot of them just like to blow through, but I did get a little bit of weld on some of them, but unfortunately not really welded good on this middle area over here. So I'm going to go take some mineral spirits, clean up the frame a little bit so that way all the dust and grime is off there. Then I'll use some POR15 and coat the unibody stiffener and all the welds. I'll probably do 2-3 coats of that, and then after that we'll use some seam sealer and then some undercoating, and it'll blend all in. So when applying this POR15, you just gotta be careful not to get any on your skin, because if it dries on there, you're gonna be wearing it for like a week or so unless you really scrub with some Scotch-Brite. But I like it because it goes on nice and thin and kind of soaks into any pitted rust or any imperfections of the weld. It just kind of soaks in there and gets to where spray paints really can't get into. Another thing is, this is like a moisture cure paint, so the more humid it is outside, the faster it's gonna dry. If you did this like on a really dry day, even if it's 90 degrees, it'll take up to like 4 to 5 hours to dry. Right now it's like 90% humidity, and I started on the bottom over here and it's already getting pretty tacky, so I'm going to assume probably in an hour it'll be all nice and hard. Alright guys, so before we start working on the other side, I do want to quickly mention today's video sponsor, and that's by Autosaver. Now Autosaver sent out some new headlight housings for a 4th gen Ram, so that's going to fit the years 2009 all the way to 2018. Now quickly taking a look at these headlight housings, right off the bat I can tell they're pretty high quality. They have everything you need, everything you would expect for a headlight housing. The only thing they don't come with is headlight bulbs, but you can swap those from your old housings. So if you guys are looking for a more stylish headlight housing on your vehicle, perhaps a blacked out one like this, check out Autosaver on the Amazon store. I'll link that below. They make them for a variety of vehicles, not just stock replacement housings. And now through September 25th, I got a discount code that's active. If you guys order these headlights, you get 10% off your order. But for right now, let's get back to the video and get that other side frame stiffener welded on the Jeep. Alright, so while that first coat of POR15 is drying on the passenger side, I'm going to get started over here on the driver's side with removing some of the undercoat here. I'm going to do the same technique as I did on the other side with just a torch and a putty knife and try and scrape as much as I can. Then I'll go in with a grinder, remove any surface rust, and get it all prepped for the frame stiffener. Over here I did notice that there was something kind of interesting that I haven't seen before, and actually inside the frame it looks like it used to be a bird's nest, and I was fishing out most of it through one of the drain holes, but you can see down there that's all what came out of the inside the frame, and there's still a lot more that's in there. So hopefully when I weld this I don't start any fires. I'm going to try and see if I can get any more out of there because of that. Now with the driver's side we do have to be careful because we have the fuel line that runs on the back side of the frame rail over here. So when using the torch for scraping off the undercoating as well as welding on the unibody stiffener, we got to be careful that we keep away from it. I might actually disconnect it from the frame and kind of wrap it in like a wet towel. That way no sparks or anything kind of get in there, as well as the evap line that goes through there, because that has obviously fuel vapors and we don't want that to go up. Another thing we got to take care of is removing the e-brake bracket, which is held on by two 13mm bolts on the back side of the frame. Those look pretty rusty on mine, so I'm going to be cautious with it, like how I was with the crossmember. So I'm going to heat it up around that welded nut inside there. I might be able to get some penetrating oil on the inside of the frame because there's some more access holes to squirt the inside, so hopefully I can get those free. Ooh, we might get lucky. Oh, beautiful. I didn't think that would come off. Like this side's coming too. Just gonna hold the bracket because it's gonna fall down. All right. Alright, so next day here. Last night I finished up getting majority of the old undercoating off. Now I'm going to go through with a wire wheel on a angle grinder. I like one of these cupped wire wheels. This one's a little bit ground down, but it should do for today. Clean it up the best I can, and then hit it with a flap disc on the heavier, rustier parts. Alright, so I got the frame stiffener up here mocked for now. What I'm going to do now is basically just trace all where I'm going to be welding. Make sure I got all the paint off and all the rust. That way we get good penetration when we weld. I also went ahead and fixed the broken bolt over here. Cut out that little tiny 1x1 inch section of the frame. Pulled out the old welding nut and welded a new welding nut with a plate and weld that back in there. So up here should be pretty close. Over here it's not quite close to the frame since there's this weird bend, so we'll just have to make sure that we grind all around there a little bit wider. Alright, so I took some mineral spirits to the frame, got it all clean. Now it's time for some weld through primer. I got a new can of it. I'm using the Seymour galvanized coating weld through primer, so hopefully it should go on nice. Alright, so as you guys just saw, I got this tacked in over here. I got 2 C-clamps this time. I went out and purchased another one. So I have the bolts for the cross member up here, so that's what's holding it up. And then I got this 2 C-clamps, and I also have a jack over here holding it up. So now that I have it tacked over here, I'm going to work towards the front and get this all tacked in. Move the C-clamps as I'm working, and then I'll start working back here. We got our one major bend over here that we'll have to use the jack to jack it up with. And then we got another one over here. Alright, so I went and got the front section all tacked in. Now coming over here to where the frame kind of goes up a little bit. They got these relief cuts in this frame stiffener here that help you to be able to bend this into place. So basically I just have a jack over here, pushed it up since it was away from the frame, and it kind of bent itself to the shape of the frame. So now I got a couple of C-clamps holding it close that way. So I'm ready to tack in this section over here, and then I'll keep working all the way towards the back, get everything all tacked in, and then I'll go back and fully weld it in. So I got it tacked in a few places. I'll keep moving along. Alright, so I got the frame stiffener all tacked in, and it's pretty much in its final resting spot. Now I'm going to start fully welding it in. I'm going to switch around and do a little bit of areas at a time, not stick in one area so that way it doesn't get too hot in one area. We just got to make sure on the back side that you be careful with the fuel line. Either wrap it in something like a towel that's all wet or something. That way you keep any sparks away from any fuel or fuel vapors. Alright, so I finished up and got this side fully welded in, and I just had enough welding wire to get it all done. It's not the prettiest welds, but they're going to hold. There is a couple holes in there where I burned through, but I'm going to take some seam sealer after we use some PR15, seal it all up, and then undercoat it so it's all going to look nice. One thing I don't like about these is that they don't have the holes already cut out in the unibody stiffeners for the parking brake brackets, so I'm going to have to go back there and probably just install some nut certs because it's going to be impossible now to try and find those holes that are already threaded into the frame. But I'm not going to do that now since I don't have those thread inserts, but we'll have to do that at a later time. So I'm going to get this all ground down one last time, get it all prepped for POR 15, put a couple coats on this, and then we'll start putting this all back together. Alright, so as that first coat is drying, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the transmission mount. So we got to get this old one out, and it's only held in by 2 more bolts. We got 2 18mm bolts going up into the transmission, so I'm just going to zip those out with the impact, and then this should come out, as well as this plate over here that attaches our exhaust bracket. We're just going to swing that down for now, and then we'll get the new one back up into place. These will be kind of tight since they do have some blue Loctite on there. That plate's going to sit down. Ooh, look at that. Nice chunk of rust that just fell from the top of the mount. Alright, so now before reinstalling our new transmission mount, I went with the bolts and put some blue Loctite back on there, so they're ready to go. And with our new transmission mount, you can see it's kind of angled a little bit, so the part that sticks down the furthest, that's going to be towards the front of the Jeep more. So we're going to orientate it like this as we bolt it in. And now the torque spec on these 2 bolts calls for 55 pound-feet of torque. One thing to keep in mind is that these nuts that came off the old transmission mount, we're going to have to reuse them on the new transmission mount over here because they didn't come with new hardware. If your nuts snapped off on the old mount, I think if you just used a flange nut for a 5/16 by 18 UNC, that should work just fine for this. Alright, so now I'm working on the passenger side over here. I'm using some seam sealer to fill in any holes or any divots in the welds to kind of smooth everything out. Right now I'm using this Dynatron seam sealer that's gray, and I did the underside of this. It's actually turning out pretty well, but this stuff dries extremely fast, so if you have any corrections to do with your finger to smooth it over, just do it right away, like 15 seconds after you put it down, because a minute later it starts tacking up and then it won't be as smooth as you try to smooth it out. Alright, so got the side all sealed up. I also went ahead and shot a couple coats of primer and then black gloss paint over it. The reason being is that the POR 15, it does hold up nice, but it doesn't like to cover on really sharp edges. Like if you have 90 degrees on a piece of metal, it just doesn't get that little corner on it since it goes on so thin. So I try to get as best coverage as I can by putting on some primer and paint. And now last thing I'm going to do is put on some rubberized undercoating, and then we should be done with it. I'm going with some 3M professional grade rubberized undercoating. You can pretty much pick it up at any auto parts store. I got mine off Amazon. Now the stuff is pretty fumy, so make sure you're wearing a respirator or in a well ventilated area. Alright, so it's the next day here, and now it's time to put on the cross member again. The POR 15 is dry on the other side. I went and sealed that. I didn't paint it and put undercoat on it yet because I want to kind of get this done tonight, and I can still spray it on after when the cross member is in, since I'm running out of time. I still do have to get the parking brake bracket on there, but I think I'm going to zip tie it up for now because I have an idea of putting some nut zerts in through the frame and bolting that on that way. While I'm at it, I'm also going to redo all of the clamps that hold on the rear brake line, as well as the evap line and fuel line. I'm going to put some nut zerts on the back side of the frame here and put some new clamps because all those plastic factory clamps actually broke off. So I have to order a tool for that, so that's going to be here next week, so I'm not going to be able to get to that today. But for the cross member, since we got our new one in, I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on these threads right here. Then I'm just going to feed one of the nuts in a 13mm socket, get it ready. And lift this back up into place. And we're going to start one bolt. And I'll snug these bolts up, nothing crazy tight on these since they're only like 5/16 bolts. Alright, now time for the bolts going up into the frame. It might be a little bit difficult lining this up, so if having another friend with you, that'll definitely help, just to maneuver it a little bit since that transmission mount is nice and tight again. We're going to jack it up a little bit, line up the holes, and then we'll slowly tighten them all up once we get it in. I'm also going to once again use anti-seize on these bolts. Leave that loose for now till we get the other side. Alright, so as you can see, I had to use a ratchet strap to kind of push this forward a little bit. Just wrapped it around the front axle and it helped kind of push the whole cross member forward. Got all the bolts in and I got them snugged up by hand. Now I'm going to go back and torque them down. And now the torque spec on these bolts is going to be 55 pound-feet of torque. Alright guys, that's going to be a wrap for today's video. I went ahead and undercoated the driver's side off camera and everything turned out well on that side. But overall, I'm happy with the results and how it looks. It's always good to change up a project every now and then since I've been doing a few videos on the J10. It's nice to break it up with the Cherokee. I definitely got a lot more in store for the Cherokee now that I've decided to somewhat build it up and not let it rot out. So I'm going to be doing a lot more rust repair on that, including floors, rockers, rear quarter panels. So you guys will have to see that coming in the future. So as always, I'll post a link in the description below for all the parts that I use in this video. Now this project did take some time, so if you expect to get it done in the afternoon, you might want to plan out a little bit longer. It took me about a week, but I had some days off and I was doing a couple hours here and there in a few days because of my work schedule. So if you guys have any questions or comments, make sure to post them below and I'll be happy to answer. If you guys want to help support the channel, I got some out Jeeping decals on the Etsy store. I'll put that in the description as well. If you guys like this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. I want to thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.